Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 591 Broken Memories. Yangfang Town, Hometown. Chapter 591 Broken Memories. Yangfang Town, Hometown. Several hours earlier, while the various teams of survivors worked in different areas specially selected and divided to optimize every second of work, as the sun had not yet risen high in the sky, and there was barely a trace of its presence in the form of a glimmer of orange light that was slowly growing and occupying the place that the night blanket had occupied during the previous hours. The temperature was considerably low, and the winds blowing from the forests, now more than 3 times wider and ampler than in the past, were especially strong. A level 12 zombie was eating the corpse of a recently born mutant weasel. Its emotionless face was stained with patches of blood in different shades of red, as proof that they did not belong to the same victim. Its fingernails were as long as claws, and its entire body was swollen to the point that it looked more like a bear than a zombie. Suddenly, the zombie seemed to realize something, so it automatically stopped its meal, and instead raised its head suddenly to look to its right. Boom! The level 12 zombie didn't even have time to see whatever was approaching, as its head took a blow that crushed every bone in its skull and pulverized its brain, before the entire head exploded into a bloody pile of pulp that flew everywhere. The lifeless zombie's body fell on its side with a thud, and dark blood slowly began to ooze out of its neck until it formed a pool of thick liquid, joining the corpse of the newborn weasel baby. 2 silhouettes running at monstrous speeds raised clouds of dust that were soon swept away by the strong pressure generated by the wind that the 2 silhouettes raised as they moved at such high speeds. Their bodies were like shadows in the middle of the night, and it did not matter whether it was mutant beast or zombie that crossed their paths, as not only did they fail to stop the charge of these 2 silhouettes, but they were all torn apart and slaughtered so easily that the encounter between the 2 parties could not be called a battle. Following the path of the now shattered road as a result of the expansion of the world, the 2 silhouettes soon left the giant shadows that rose into the sky as if they wanted to touch the clouds, and their appearances were revealed as the light of the stars, growing dimmer and dimmer under the impending presence of the sun, fell upon them. The man was handsome enough to make women blush. The woman was beautiful enough to take any man's breath away with a single glance. Of course, these 2 were Bai Zemin and Shangyuan Bingshu, who were aiming for Yangfang Town, the place where Bai Zemin was born and grew up with his loved ones. To reach Yangfang Town from Xietain Town, it was necessary to travel about 2 to 3 hours in a car, depending on many factors. However, this was only in the past, when the Earth had not yet expanded in size. Therefore, it was not crazy to assume that if one wanted to reach Yangfang Town from Xietain Town via vehicle at this moment, it would probably take about half a day's time. Fortunately, both Bai Zemin and Shangyuan Bingshu were soul evolvers whose stats could not be represented by their levels. Furthermore, while Bai Zemin's soul power was purer than Shangyuan Bingshu's, she had been adding at least half of her stat points in agility since day 1, when the apocalypse broke out, and she leveled up for the first time, unlike Bai Zemin, who used his stat points depending on his needs in times of crisis. At speeds ranging from 500 to 600 kilometers per hour, the 2 would soon reach the destination they aspired to, no matter how much the Earth may have expanded. The first minute was pristine silence, and with Bai Zemin leading the way, Shangyuan Bingshu just watched his movements in silence. Anything that appeared in his path was crushed regardless of race, level, order, features, etc. Every step he took forward was heavy despite his firmness, exposing how fluctuating his heart was. Of course, Shangyuan Bingshu understood. After all, she would surely be the same once they conquered Changping District and reached Xietain District located to the south, where her mother lived. However, she was also worried about him, especially his mental health. After another minute of silence, Shangyuan Bingshu finally could not bear it, and in the middle of the night where the winds were howling loudly, her beautiful voice traveled forward. I just want to be sure you know, but you are aware that Yangfang Town shouldn't be much different from Xietain Town in terms of situation, right? The voice of Shangyuan Bingshu was quite careful and gentle, considering that usually, her tone of voice was mainly devoid of emotions. After all, this was a rather delicate matter, and she was really worried about how he would react to the inevitable reality. Don't worry, Bingshu. Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder at her with a slight smile, and nodded as he continued to charge forward. I know better than anyone that Yangfang Town was definitely destroyed when the Earth began to expand. I'm not going there to find my loved ones, I just want to make sure of a few matters. That's all. I see. Shangyuan Bingshu nodded, and a glint of confusion flashed in her eyes, but she said nothing and simply followed him silently. Shang Yuan Bingshu's confusion stemmed from the fact that if Bai Zemin just wanted to make sure of a few matters, then why on earth did he tell his housekeeper Qin Ming that at the very least he would be gone all day? After all, Yangfang Town was not a place too far away for people such as them who could get there in a matter of minutes. But she believed that her doubts would be cleared up by accompanying him, so she didn't ask. At the end of the day, the main reason why Shang Yuan Bingshu decided to follow Bai Zemin was due to the fact that she was worried about him getting out of control or becoming heartbroken when he found something uncomfortable. I hope they are all right, she sighed in her heart and prayed silently. Shang Yuan Bingshu knew perfectly well that death was like the bread and butter in this world. Therefore, she could only pray that Bai Zemin's family would be all right, as the last thing she wanted was to see him broken. Not long after, as the two remained silent and with the wind accompanied by the occasional roars of some creatures that resided deep in the woods, Yangfang Town appeared in Bai Zemin's and Shang Yuan Bingshu's range of vision. No, this place could no longer be called Yangfang Town. It would perhaps be more correct to call this place as the place where Yangfang Town had once existed. Bai Zemin's charge gradually stopped as he forcefully planted both feet on the ground, and Shang Yuan Bingshu imitated his movements with agility, practically stopping both of them at the same time. Bai Zemin silently observed the place that was still about 200 to 300 meters ahead before he began to slowly walk over there. Shang Yuan Bingshu stared at the large blocks of rubble and the cracked foundations of what had once been buildings before her eyes shifted to focus on Bai Zemin's back as he slowly walked away step by step. Then, with a determined expression on her face, she took a step forward followed by another, and then another, and then another, following him silently from far enough away to give him his space, but close enough for him not to feel alone. Slowly, the distance was closed, and before Bai Zemin knew it he was walking on what were once perfectly paved streets, but were now destroyed beyond salvation. Occasionally, a large concrete block would appear in his path, so he had no choice but to move or jump over it to continue on his way. Nor were there rare moments when the sound of glass crunching after being stepped on would break the natural silence of the area. Like the areas where cement was being prepared to begin construction, the smell of dust with a tinge of cement scent had become the favorite fragrance of the area. The invisible cloud of gloom was so heavy that it even seemed to be too much for the beasts of the nearest forest, as there were no living creatures in sight. Except, of course, for the two souls that walked like spirits aimlessly through the streets, one in front and the other following step by step from behind. About 10 minutes later, Bai Zemin's footsteps stopped. He stood staring to his right with a blank stare, as if his spirit had traveled back in time to try to relive memories that may not have been important then, but were important now. Unfortunately, the place where those memories were created was no longer standing to be able to relive them. Shang Yuan Bingshu, curious, walked without making any noise, and stopped a couple of steps away from what seemed to have been a large entrance. She looked up and noticed that there was a large clearing of at least 3 or 4 blocks. In the center of the site was once a large building, possibly 2 or 3 stories high, but now, it was nothing more than a pile of collapsed rubble scattered haphazardly on the ground. Yangfang Spring, Bai Zemin said out of nowhere. Although his voice was low, it sounded too loud amidst the total silence that reigned in the area. This is where I studied when I was just a kid. Shang Yuan Bingshu looked at him when she heard his voice, but she realized that while Bai Zemin was looking up at the collapsed building, his eyes seemed to see a completely different view. It was as if in his eyes, he could still glimpse children playing, having fun, while the teachers watched from the high windows with joyful smiles. After a moment, Bai Zemin looked ahead and continued to advance step by step. Shang Yuan Bingshu looked at the fallen building again, and noticed that under the rubble, there were some crushed limbs, along with a lot of dried blood. The dried blood was probably the result of a battle that may have broken out at the beginning of the apocalypse, or perhaps later. As for the limbs, most were too small to belong to an adult. A glint of sadness flashed briefly in the eyes of the woman known as Ice Princess for her indifference, before she began to follow in the footsteps of the young man, who even in the midst of all this destruction, seemed to know every intersection like the back of his hand. What happened before was repeated on several more occasions. Sometimes, Bai Zemin would stop and stand silently staring at a particular spot for several minutes, as if trying to remember, or as if trying to relive the former appearance of what was nothing more than rubble. Then, he would comment briefly and concisely on the experiences he once had with that building in some way or another, before shaking his head and moving on. Ice cream store where he used to go with his elementary school classmates during the hot summer days. Convenience store run by an old woman who always gave him candy and bragged about her past beauty for the amusement of the children. playroom where he went with his friends on several occasions to have fun or clear his mind after an exhausting day of tests. One by one, Bai Zemin told Shangyuan Bingshu parts of his past that, small or not, were part of who he was today. Unfortunately, those places that carried so many small but important parts of his past were now completely broken. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 592 Emotions on the Verge of Collapse. Chapter 592 Emotions on the Verge of Collapse. Memories were present, but the places where those memories took birth were no longer what they once were. Even if someone wished to rebuild Yangfang Town and succeeded in making it a replica of its past, nothing would ever be the same again. The passage of time and destruction were probably the two most terrifying laws that existed, as no one could really escape them. Time slowly corroded us, making us suffer step by step, as if countless thorns pricked our feet with every step we took. On the other hand, destruction simply swept over everything mercilessly and somehow or other always hurt us, even if we managed to escape from it. Shangyuan Bingshu did not know how Bai Zemin felt, because although his steps were steady and uniform as always, his back at this moment looked a little lonelier than usual. Those wide shoulders that seemed to be able to hold up the heavens on their own had even shrunk a little, as if they were tired from taking so many relentless strikes. But even though she could not understand how he felt, what Shangyuan Bingshu knew for certain was that it was definitely not a nice feeling to see the place where you was born, grew up, and lived most of your life, leveled to the point where there was nothing left of its former glory. Even though this was the place where he was born and raised, even though it was the place where countless smiles and tears were shed, the main protagonists who formed the story above the stage known as Yangfang Town were gone, and the stage had been flattened. Even Bai Zemin himself did not know how he felt as he stared with lost and dull eyes at the scene in front of him. Of course, he knew that he would find his hometown destroyed. Even so, being aware of something was often not enough preparation for when we were faced with the reality we knew we would have to face. If Bai Zemin had to describe how he was feeling right now, then it would probably be as follows: lonely, exhausted, beaten down, and maybe, just maybe, a little sad. Time passed, and before Bai Zemin realized it, several hours had flown by since he had been walking aimlessly. Shangyuan Bingshu, who had been following him silently but steadily a few steps behind, sighed as she finally realized the reason why he had been continually turning at different intersections. She took several steps forward, quickening the pace of her walk and catching up with Bai Zemin in a matter of seconds. Then, she grabbed his hand and forced him to stop dead in his tracks. Bingshu? Bai Zemin looked at her in surprise due to her sudden action. Shangyuan Bingshu looked at him with kind eyes and gently squeezed his hand as she said in a soft voice, "I know you are afraid to face reality. I also understand your fear because I feel that same fear now, and it will surely be many times worse when we reach my home. But we have to move forward. Staying stuck in a single point is no solution to anything." Even though both he and she were wearing combat gloves, Bai Zemin could feel Shangyuan Bingshu's emotions being transmitted to the palm of his hand. Hearing her words, he was first surprised before smiling bitterly as he shook his head. "I am so evident?" said Bai Zemin as he tousled his hair with his other hand. With the same gentle smile on her beautiful face, a smile capable of charming even ghosts, and a smile that Bai Zemin had never seen on her face before, Shangyuan Bingshu kept her blue eyes fixed on his black eyes as she said softly, "It's not that you're obvious. It's that your thoughts and feelings are the thoughts and feelings that anyone would feel in this kind of situation." Shangyuan Bingshu realized that although Bai Zemin was continuously walking around the now destroyed Yangfang Town, there was always an area in which he avoided moving. Considering what this place meant and represented to him, it was not genius to realize that Bai Zemin feared going to the place where he once lived. He dreaded seeing his home turn to ruins, and even more dreaded finding his loved ones lifeless nearby. There was no shortage of murdered zombie corpses that were found as they walked, and there was no shortage of human bodies mutilated by some beast. It was clear that in this place, as in any other part of the world, had been fought one or more fierce battles for survival, and what Bai Zemin feared most was to find the corpse of a member of his family. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and held his breath for several seconds before letting the air escape from his lungs. A flash of resolve shone in his midnight black eyes, and he said slowly, "Thank you for that. I'm fine now." Shangyuan Bingshu forced a smile and nodded, letting go of his hand slowly. She didn't say anything since, even though Bai Zemin said he was fine now, she knew it was impossible to be really fine. She didn't want to disrespect the resolution he had managed to find after so much effort, and even less worry him more. Therefore, she again took slow steps backward while looking at him, as if she was afraid he would disappear or do something crazy the next moment. "Am I a crystal vase now?" Xietain forced a smile into his heart and shook his head before turning around and turning to head now with faster steps towards that direction he had been avoiding all this time. Shangyuan Bingshu looked around as if she was looking for someone, but that person was nowhere in sight. What struck her as strange was that she, the first woman who managed to successfully win her rivalry with such strength, should definitely be here considering how important this was to Xietain. Then, a serious voice resounded in her head. "Of course I'm here. How could I not accompany the man who would accompany me to the end of time at a crucial moment for him like this? I am simply giving you a head start, so that when I crush you later you will have no complaints and accept your destined defeat willingly." The corner of Shangyuan Bingshu's mouth turned into a sneer, but she said nothing. Lilith's words went in through her right ear and out through her left ear, as it was more important for her to focus on Xietain than on words that from a certain point of view were meaningless. Soon, the two existences visible to the naked eye arrived at a slightly secluded area. Here, the number of collapsed buildings was fewer, while the gardens were larger. Shangyuan Bingshu quickly followed in Xietan's footsteps, turning around several corners and jumping over some destroyed houses until she finally stopped dead in her tracks a moment after he stopped. In front of her, a house, or rather what had once been a house, was completely flattened until not even a single wall was left standing. Just judging by the amount of rubble, it was clear that the house was not too big, only one story. Shangyuan Bingshu judged that this place was probably once occupied by a 6-part structure, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen, 1 living room. In addition, for some reason one of the rooms had been built later than the rest. Just as Shangyuan Bingshu wondered the reason, Xietain spoke without looking back. "This is my home here. Well, it once was," he said. His voice sounded quite calm, so it was hard to tell what kind of expression he was making or what his deepest feelings were like. "At first, there were only 3 of us, so 2 rooms were all that was necessary. Later, when my younger sister joined the family, she and I shared a room for a few years until it became a little inappropriate for a man and a teenage woman to share a room. At the end of the day, women need their space and privacy more than us men in certain aspects." Xietain knelt down on his right knee and slowly began to remove debris as he calmly said, "So, my father and I built another room next to mine in order for her to have her own space. Well, since our family wasn't rich or anything, it was a little difficult to build the whole room right away, so it took a few months as my parents saved up the money for it." The sound of metal gloves hitting debris or the clinking of metal chains linking the defensive cloak to the shoulder pads accompanied every movement Xietain made, followed by a slight explosion, caused every time a piece of debris was removed. I must say that although it was a relief to have Menkai leave my room since adolescence is a complicated stage, it was also somewhat disappointing. After so many years of sharing a room, the 2 of us had become like buddies who would accompany each other before going to sleep. As Xietain talked about his life with his family, Shangyuan Bingshu finally understood the reason why he was doing this. It was to avoid thinking too much about the now. He was forcing himself to remember the past to try to get away from the present, but still living in it, as his hands kept removing debris. Shangyuan Bingshu slowly closed her eyes and stood for a few seconds. Finally, her eyes gently opened again, and without saying a word she walked to the opposite side of where Xietain was standing before she started moving debris. Even though it would be easy for her to sweep this whole place in a second considering her strength, Shangyuan Bingshu was not an unfeeling woman as she seemed, or as everyone thought. In fact, she was so observant and understanding that she even noticed that Xietain was being careful not to break even one rock, even though he was picking them up and tossing them aside with apparent indifference. Sensing noise behind him, Xietain stopped his movements for a moment, and looking over his shoulder a faint smile appeared on his face. He shook his head before continuing to move debris, being careful, but squeezing hard to keep his hands from trembling, in the same way his heart was trembling. To him, each piece of rubble he removed was no different than opening a different Pandora's box, since he didn't know what would be found underneath. A zombie? A mutant beast? Goblin? Or maybe... In this kind of situation, Xietain felt that finding nothing was better than finding something after all. Finding would give him answers, but would also mean bad news. But not finding, while it might be cruel, would at least keep the hope of they are okay alive. Xietain and Shangyuan Bingshu could remove the rubble of a building several dozen stories high in a matter of seconds. However, even after 30 minutes, the sound of rocks being moved could still be heard from far away. Approximately 40 minutes later, Xietain finally stopped and stood up. He had just cleaned the entire right side of the place that was once his home. He found many broken things such as TV, flower vases, tables, armchairs, stove, refrigerator, and so on. However, there was nothing more than that. Xietain sighed in relief and smiled bitterly as he whispered in a low voice that only he could hear, "To think that I would feel so joyful for not being able to find a trace of my family. How ironic." Just at that moment, Shangyun Bingshu's somewhat trembling voice sounded from behind him. "Hey Xietain, you need to see this." Xietan's face turned pale as a sheet, and his body trembled as if he had been struck by lightning. He had been praying in his heart that Shangyun Bingshu would not call him at all. However, it seemed that the gods really did not want him, as once again, those prayers went unheard, let alone reciprocated. It was then when Xietain remembered that, at the end of the day, there were no gods to help mankind, that he and all the others were alone in this. Xietain turned around stiffly and with trembling eyes. This was undoubtedly the first time he showed such a weak and broken expression and attitude in front of another living being other than Lilith, as even at his worst he stood his ground. Emotions were dangerous, a double-edged sword that could make us stronger in a second, but could also topple the strongest from its throne in an instant. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 593 Menkai. Chapter 593 Menkai. Shangyun Bingshu had her head slightly tilted down, and her body was sideways. This, coupled with her surprise, made her unable to notice the kind of expression Xietain had on his face at that precise moment, nor did it let her realize the effect her careless words as a result of her shock had on him. What is it?" Xietain asked in a trembling voice. He, who was not afraid to face creatures the size of buildings, did not dare to turn around completely for fear of what he would find there. That Xietain, who fought bravely even when his enemies were more powerful than him and finally achieving victory thanks to countless carefully developed strategies in the course of the battle, was now like a mindless fool who could neither see nor think things through clearly. Or otherwise, he would definitely have realized that if what Shangyun Bingshu had found was someone's corpse, she would definitely not have chosen to use such careless words out of respect for him and the possibility that the said corpse belonged to one of his loved ones. Be that as it may, the trembling voice, as well as the fear contained in Xietan's question, awakened Shangyun Bingshu from her state of shock. She raised her face and turned her head to look in his direction, finding Xietain standing stiffly and motionless, as he gritted his teeth hard in an attempt to stand firm. The blue eyes of Shangyun Bingshu flashed with a hint of guilt as she realized her mistake, and not wanting him to suffer any more, she quickly turned and raised her right hand in the air before saying loudly, "Look, I found a note in this room." Xietain froze in place, and the slight uncontrollable trembling that struck his body stopped as he heard Shangyun Bingshu's words. He blinked in confusion as he stared forward in puzzlement as a consequence of experiencing traveling to hell, only to be held tightly and pulled to the heaven by a large hand, before his body fell into the pit of eternal fire. A note? When these words finally clicked in Xietan's brain, his body moved on its own, and in an instant he appeared before Shangyun Bingshu, as if he was a ghost, scaring her a bit. Xietain looked at her left hand and saw that indeed, being grasped by her hand, was a small white paper torn and stained with pink, probably a consequence of the dried paint chips belonging to the collapsed wall, but peeled off during the collapse. He reached forward tremblingly and slowly as he stared at the dirty paper, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. In fact, Xietain did not dare to snatch it from Shangyun Bingshu, for fear that his carelessness would destroy that little white paper, despite the rush of his heart urging him to do it once and for all. Shangyun Bingshu, understanding how he felt, extended her hand forward, while holding the tip of the paper between her fingers, to allow Xietain to take it with ease as she carefully explained, judging from the pale pink color of the walls, as well as the surrounding high school books, "I took the freedom to assume that this room formerly belonged to your younger sister." Once Xietain grabbed the paper with trembling hands, he shook it very carefully in a meaningless attempt to get the dirt off of it. That piece of paper was flattened by a big rock next to the desk. Shangyun Bingshu finished explaining everything before falling silent to let Xietain read the note, however briefly. Before reading the contents written on the piece of paper, Xietain looked at it in detail, and for the first time, he realized the reason why Shangyun Bingshu often managed to notice things that most overlooked. Menkai was a very careful and detail-oriented young woman. Everything she did was always flawless, as one of her life mottos was "do it right or don't do it at all." From cooking dinner to helping her mother clean the house, when Menkai engaged in a task the result was destined to be brilliant. That was the kind of woman she was and aspired to be. Of course, when it came to school, the amount of effort she put in was always 200% of her usual. After all, she was fully aware of the sacrifice Xietain was making for her, and what Menkai least wanted was to waste the kindness he showed her. Xietain could still remember the beautiful calligraphy of Menkai, and even clearly recall the numerous amount of praise she received for it. Many even joked that perhaps she could become a great master in this field. So, one could imagine the rush a person with this kind of character had to be in to tear off a piece of paper carelessly, and to write as haphazardly as Menkai had done on the paper Xietain was holding right now. Despite the colossal difference, Xietain could not possibly mistake the fineness of each trace. It had definitely been Menkai. South. Army. Xietain muttered and suddenly felt his legs tremble. The face of Xietain Bingshu changed slightly and hurriedly stepped forward to support him. In fact, Xietain was so weak at this point that he could not even control his body. Had it not been for Xietain Bingshu, he would definitely have fallen to his knees at this stage. Xietain Bingshu did not say anything. To begin with, she was a woman who usually didn't talk much and even less in this kind of circumstance. What she did was to help Xietain sit on a large piece of rubble, and after making sure he was okay, she sat down next to him. The tense nerves of Xietain finally released completely, but this also caused all the strength in his body to leave him. Even he, who was capable of fighting for days and nights against an army of millions, lost more than a few hundred stamina points as a result of the tension that shook his soul to its core. The eyes of Xietain Bingshu flashed with a hint of pain as she saw his sweat-soaked face. She knew he loved his family tremendously, but she hadn't expected him to be enduring so much. She had no way of understanding the effect the Skillstone Heart had on Xietain, despite knowing how the skill worked. For 2.5 months now, every step Xietain took felt tremendously heavy. His heart was never at ease, and even during the night, he found it difficult to fall asleep, wondering if his loved ones had gone to bed with an empty stomach, or if they were cold in the freezing temperatures that embraced the world during the night. There were more than a few times when his mind almost went into disarray after merely imagining the possibility of them not surviving. No one but Xietain himself knew how much stress he had been living under all this time. Therefore, now that he finally got a clear clue and positive signs, all that tension hit him without warning, almost knocking him out on the spot. If any other person who knew him saw the current Xietain, they would probably doubt that the brave and always steadfast warrior had anything to do with the current him. Many would definitely see him as pathetic and weak for falling into such a miserable condition, even though he had not fought a real battle. However, in the eyes of Xietain Bingshu, the battle that Xietain had just fought was far more dangerous than any other. It had been a battle that could have brought him down forever, and worst of all, in that battle he was a mere spectator. Moreover, to Xietain Bingshu, the fact that Xietain allowed himself to fall like this in front of her also meant that he trusted her enough to show weakness. Otherwise, she was 100% sure that a proud and cautious man as him would definitely not allow himself to fall down like that in front of anyone. Seconds passed and those seconds turned into minutes as they clustered amongst themselves. About 10 minutes later, Xietain Bingshu noticed that Xietan's breathing had stabilized, for which she asked faintly, "Are you okay?" Xietain did not respond immediately, and instead took several deep breaths before finally nodding. He nodded a second time and said in a louder tone than necessary, "I'm fine, I'm fine." The second "I'm fine" represented the real "I'm fine." The first was clearly him trying to convince himself. Xietain Bingshu smiled slightly and said in a more cheerful tone of voice, "Congratulations. You are now closer to meet your loved ones as you have always wanted." Xietan's eyes lit up upon hearing these words. He looked at her with a big smile on his face and nodded vigorously, This was the first time since the apocalypse began that Xietain smiled not only from the bottom of his heart, but also with complete freedom from worry. At the same time, it was the first time Xietain Bingshu was stunned by a man's smile, the first time she experienced in person what many men experienced when they saw her for the first time. Having no idea what Xietain Bingshu was feeling, Xietain jumped to his feet and stretched both arms skyward with clenched fists, still clutching that small paper note, as if it were his most valuable treasure. The bones in his body thundered noisily, and his shoulders became firmer than ever, as if a great weight had been lifted from them, easing the burdens he carried at all times on his back. Although he did not know how long had this note written by Menkai, the only thing that mattered was that at least the hopes that they were all well were higher now. At the very least, there was no bad news, and now Bai Zemin even had a clearer target than ever in his head. By the way, your younger sister sure is impressive. Shangyun Bingshu stood up and approached him. Once she got his attention, she said with impossible to hide astonishment, to think that in the midst of all the chaos, she still managed to leave you a short but clear message. Even more amazing though is her faith that you would definitely be fine and get here. One had to know that Bai Zemin was an entire district away from Menkai and his parents, not to mention the fact that to get here as quickly as possible, he would have to find a way to clear out countless zombies that would surely occupy the large cities and villages located to the south and north of the Eastern Sea. But even then, Menkai risked losing several seconds that could have cost her a lot just to leave a note, as if she was sure her big brother would see it. This was something that not only shocked Shangyun Bingshu, but also filled her with admiration and curiosity for this young girl, as Shangyun Bingshu herself wondered if she would ever be able to do such a thing. Bai Zemin chuckled and seemed very satisfied with Shangyun Bingshu's praise for his younger sister. If Shangyun Bingshu praised someone else, then he would be surprised as she was a very proud woman, and practically no one was worthy of her praise. However, when she praised Menkai, he took it as a natural thing to do. Even so, he did not comment on it, and instead looked up at the now clear blue sky with a happy smile. It would be difficult for Shangyun Bingshu to understand the kind of person Menkai was unless she met her in person. Therefore, he simply said the following: Bingshu, I bet you will get along well with my younger sister when you meet her. She will definitely be able to occupy an important position in the noble government along with you, Wu Yijin, and the rest. Bai Zemin's smile was like that of a child free of impurities and evil thoughts. No one could ever associate this Bai Zemin with the Bai Zemin, who had slaughtered nearly 1 billion asuras directly or indirectly, among whom there was no lack of children and the elderly. At the same time, in his eyes, the sky had never been as beautiful as it was at this moment. I look forward to it then. Shangyun Bingshu chuckled and felt really happy for him. Bai Zemin really deserved this brief moment of freedom and joy, as he had been by far the hardest working of them all. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 594 Unnatural. Chapter 594 Unnatural. Standing approximately 30 kilometers away from where Yangfang Town was once standing, two slender but curvaceous silhouettes stood side by side at the top of a tree over 800 meters high. One of them wore leather armor that clung tightly to every curve of her lovely body, giving her transcendental beauty the charm of a demon, while the other wore a black dress as soft as silk, that with the strong winds blowing strongly, especially from the south, caused the back of her body to stand out, so that a raised and firm bottom was clearly marked. One of them had beautiful long hair that reached to her lower back, whose color swayed between white and silver. The other was the complete opposite. Her hair was as black as midnight devoid of stars, but was slightly longer than that of the other girl. Of course, these two were Shangyun Bingshu and Lilith. Although the two women were silent, if there was a third party present, they could definitely notice the tension in the atmosphere surrounding that silence. After what seemed like an eternity of tension, Shangyun Bingshu broke the silence in a cold voice. "Won't you stop him?" Lilith glanced sideways at her for a second before looking forward and lazily saying, "Why don't you try to stop him for yourself? Or do you just admit that he'll listen to me but not you?" HMPH. Shangyun Bingshu snorted and decided to stay in silence, as a flare of anger threatened to ignite inside her chest. Boo-om! Suddenly, the two women's attention was drawn by the sound of a loud explosion coming from the distance. A fierce shockwave spread in an arc in all directions and the ground split apart, revealing huge cracks, as the earth rumbled as if an earthquake had struck the area. In the distance, Shangyun Bingshu and Lilith saw a huge cloud of dust rising into the sky, slowly being tossed back and forth by the forest winds. A few seconds later, a silhouette appeared in the horizon, and in a matter of moments appeared just below the tree where the two women were standing. They, as if by prior arrangement, jumped up to meet the newcomer. Bai Zemin watched in wonder, and his eyes flashed with a hint of admiration as his dark pupils reflected the images of the two women who seemed to float in the sky, descending to solid ground, as if they were two beautiful butterflies fluttering in the wind. "Done?" Lilith asked with a smile. Bai Zemin nodded in response with a relieved smile on his face. Seeing him smile like that, even though Shangyun Bingshu knew what the answer she would receive would be, she couldn't help but ask in confusion, "No regrets? You just completely erased any trace that may have ever existed of your hometown." Bai Zemin closed his eyes and shook his head before opening them again, and saying in a relieved voice, "I have no regrets, Bingshu. Yangfang Town was no longer Yangfang Town from the moment its inhabitants and those people close to me stopped living there. All that was left of what was once my home was a destroyed and miserable image that I would rather not see again. That's why I did what I did. The decision of completely destroying whatever traces were left behind of what was once Yangfang Town was a decision that Bai Zemin made more easily than he thought. Once he knew that his loved ones were probably alive, much of the pent-up tension and pent-up nerves were completely released, and with that, it was much simpler for him to take certain actions that in the past might have been dragging him down. Of course, before turning Yangfang Town into nothing more than a huge empty crater several kilometers in diameter after attacking with Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words, Bai Zemin made sure to save any portraits or objects that his loved ones might consider important, but had no choice but to leave behind due to the circumstances of the moment. Although 99% of the things were broken due to the collapse during the expansion of the world, things like photos, stuffed animals, even clothes could be saved. Bai Zemin kept all of that in his ring, and hoped to be able to return them to their respective owners soon. I see Shangyun Bingshu nodded slowly but firmly at the end, as if she finally managed to understand something of his feelings. Then, she raised her head to look him in the eyes and asked, "What do we do now? It's just after 10 in the morning. Shall we go back to the base now, or?" Shangyun Bingshu did not finish her words because she believed that Bai Zemin could understand the meaning of what she was trying to express. In fact, Bai Zemin did not disappoint her when he shook his head and said in a firm voice, "No. I will head south and look for traces of any human camp." Of course, Shangyun Bingshu was not surprised at all by Bai Zemin's choice, and instead would have been surprised if he took another path. "Then I will go with you," she said as firmly and resolutely as the words he spoke a moment ago. Bai Zemin forced a smile into his heart and couldn't help but shook his head. Controlling Shangyun Bingshu was really difficult because while she was technically his subordinate, she was also a very dear friend to him. Therefore, there was no way he could force her to do something she didn't want to do, unless there was really no other choice. Besides, he admitted in his heart that Shangyun Bingshu's presence was somehow calming to him. If Bai Zemin was like a flame that could burst out at any moment and cause disasters, then Shangyun Bingshu was the frost raining down from the sky and striving to prevent the flame from bursting out completely. In a way, she and Lilith were very much alike, no matter how much the two women fought with each other or disliked each other. Although both Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu could run at lightning speeds and travel great distances in a short time, China was one of the largest countries in the world. Moreover, the expansion of the Earth by more than 3 times its previous size had simply amplified that already colossal size to a degree that no human being would probably be able to comprehend. Several hours passed and during that time the two traveled through many areas of Changping district, such as Yanshu Town, whose population once numbered over 30,000, Xingshu Town with previously over 40,000 inhabitants, Shisenling Town with just over 20,000, Liakan Village with just over 15,000, Machiku Town whose population once exceeded 70,000, and many other areas. Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu even launched an attack on a big city, such as Bikijia City, whose population numbered over 300,000 in the past. However, there was no trace of human survival at all, and the inhabitants of that area were zombies, which after a quick work between the two, were slaughtered to the point of leaving none alive. Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu made a point in their minds to order the troops to visit Bikijia City as soon as possible, since there they found a large steel factory, and an even larger factory, with many tools and machines, needed to process cloth and wool, that would definitely be useful. In a single evening, Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu completely swept through the entire Huang subdistrict. Without the help of a third party, the two of them single-handedly crushed every obstacle that dared to cross their paths. Although neither of them said anything, their eyes expressed more than any words could ever convey. Both he and she were certain that this was the first time they had ever felt so free and carefree while fighting. This was by far the first time Shangyun Bingshu and Bai Zemin realized that if they really wanted to, together, they could conquer China in such a short time that it would surely leave anyone trembling in fear. No delays and no worrying about a growing kingdom, just fighting and crushing with overwhelming and absolute power. However, there was something that left both of them dumbfounded, and when they looked at each other, it was reflected in their disbelieving eyes. By the time the sun finally descended completely, having traveled through one entire sub-district and half of another, Shangyun Bingshu and Bai Zemin had yet to see even one human encampment. All they found were areas ruined by collapses, but the unusual thing was that there was no one who had been crushed to death by debris, as even after inspecting the surrounding corpses, they realized that all of them had all died too long ago, when compared to the expanse of the earth. What they did find, however, were many traces of battle in several of the main areas they inspected. Bullet casings of different calibers, metal pieces belonging to missiles near devastated areas, crushed cannonballs, corpses of beasts, humans, and zombies that were slaughtered by gunfire, etc. It was clear that a rather ambitious but also intelligent person took advantage of every second to take control of many areas. This must be Uncle Wu's doing, Shangyun Bingshu said as she ran alongside Bai Zemin a bit panting. She was not a monster with practically inexhaustible stamina like him, so after several hours of practically running at full speed and constant fighting, naturally began to take its toll on her stamina stat. Uncle Wu? Bai Zemin's ears twitched as if they were little antennae that finally picked up something interesting, and he looked at the girl beside him as he said in a deep voice, "You mean Wu Yijin's father?" Shangyun Bingshu nodded and calmly revealed, "Uncle Wu is a very intelligent man. Many might think that the reason he managed to become Changping District's total mayor is due to his relationship with the Wu family, but in reality, few know that he got that position without using family connections at all. If you ask me what kind of person he is, I would say he is the kind of man who, while he can be kind, also knows when to be cruel and to take the slightest opportunity at the most opportune time." As the two continued to move along one of the main roads leading to one of the biggest cities in Longzhewen subdistrict, Shangyun Bingshu continued, "So far, we have encountered what were once definitely human bases, but they were all attacked by advanced infantry. While it could be the work of the army separately, and Uncle Wu might have little or nothing to do with all this, I refuse to believe that different armies and bases would use the same method to attack so many areas in such a short time." Shangyun Bingshu's words made a lot of sense from Bai Zemin's point of view for many reasons. But chief among them was that just as she said, it was hard to believe that so many attacks and conquests would be carried out in such a short time, unless it was all planned by one person with an end goal. Bai Zemin frowned slightly with a somewhat heavy heart. If Wu Qiqian was really an ambitious man just as Shangyun Bingshu had just said, but it'd save his family whether in passing or not, then Bai Zemin might find himself in a dilemma about what to do next. Around midnight, Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu finally stopped their steps as they looked off into the distance with astonished expressions, after stumbling upon what was undoubtedly a post-apocalyptic building, and the largest they had ever seen to date. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 595 Colossal Size Base. Chapter 595 Colossal Size Base. Since the apocalypse broke out until the present day, members of the Transcendent faction found many human camps. Some of them were nothing more than minor villages occupied by some low-ranking bandits, who after gaining some power and having lost their senses in the face of the arrival of the end of the world, began to do atrocities of all kinds, and to indulge in their desires. On the other hand, there were also human camps duly led by a person with at least some capacity. These people, while not saints in the same way that Bai Zemin himself was not, at least maintained a base level of their humanity without being damaged. Among these camps, there were some large ones with several thousand survivors, and there were also small ones with no more than a few dozen at most. The worst ones did not even have wooden fences around them as a basic defense. As for the best ones such as the Baquin Camp and the North Camp, these types of camps were the largest that Bai Zemin had seen so far. Like his faction, the leaders of these two bases had managed to take advantage of the terrain and constructions of the past to erect wooden walls at least about 5 meters high, with which they could keep the zombies at bay in case any tried to sneak in, and they could also buy at least a few seconds of time for the smaller and weaker but still dangerous mutant beasts for normal survivors. Bai Zemin was honestly proud of what he had accomplished as a leader so far. He went from being an ordinary college student without any prior training or backing to becoming the leader of a human base, with over 30,000 survivors under his command, and thousands of subordinates, waiting for a single command from him to mobilize and sweep in the direction he pointed. Today, however, Bai Zemin realized for the first time that he was far behind when compared to someone who had a smoother and easier start or beginning stage than someone like him had. For the love of God, Shangyun Bingshu looked at the huge structure several kilometers away with wide eyes. In the distance, a huge wall could be seen which had been built using mutant trees over 300 meters tall. From the position where they both stood, a long line could be seen stretching several kilometers across, and in the eyes of Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu, that line was not unlike a world divider, as neither of them could see what was on the other side. As if that were not enough, more than 20 towers could be seen rising for at least another 100 meters high above the walls, making it a lot easier to take out the enemies for the troops stationed there, as well as providing the entire base in general with great security, in the form of vision and terrain analysis. But the walls and the huge watchtowers were not all. Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu noticed line after line of pits dug in the ground about 4 kilometers from the base, while 3 kilometers from the base, there were all sorts of obstacles that would definitely be useless against intelligent beings, but would certainly serve a wonderful function against slow zombies, with no ability to think or reason. Even without turning around, the two knew in their hearts that the line they saw was but one of probably 4 large lines that made up a huge box or rectangle to protect the inside from the outside. This was without a doubt the firmest and sturdiest human base that Bai Zemin or any other member of his faction had ever seen. "What do you think?" Shangyun Bingshu took a deep breath before looking at Bai Zemin for his opinion. He smiled bitterly and said with some self-conscious embarrassment, "I was feeling proud of our base and the idea of building a city, but it looks like someone beat me to it by at least a month away." Shangyun Bingshu frowned as she noticed Bai Zemin's slightly low mood, and said in a slightly disappointed voice, "Bai Zemin, since how long have you become a man whose shoulders fall for something so simple?" That's not it." Bai Zemin shook his head and clarified, "I admit it's a bit depressing, but that's all. At the end of the day, I'm sure that the person ruling this base definitely possessed great power since before the apocalypse, which allowed him or her to prepare for everything better." Shangyun Bingshu's expression eased a bit after hearing this. She nodded and while looking straight ahead said calmly, Unlike the ruler or rulers of this base, we had to strive to pull together each and every little grain of sand to get here. From mere college students we made it this far without help from anyone but ourselves. We should be proud of that." "Of course." Bai Zemin nodded as if it was natural. Suddenly, Shangyun Bingshu thought of something funny and chuckled as she said, "Besides, what's the use of having high walls when a single blow can bring everything down in a heartbeat? Do you want me to go and try it?" A shiver ran down Bai Zemin's spine as he heard Shangyun Bingshu's words, and unconsciously said in an altered voice, "Don't do it. To begin with, they were not enemies of this base. Besides, Bai Zemin was 90% sure that if his family was really alive, then they should be somewhere beyond those giant walls." Shangyun Bingshu stopped chuckling and looked at him indifferently as she said in a clear voice, "Of course, I am joking." The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth twitched, and he subconsciously thought of something, but wisely decided to keep it in his heart, instead of saying it out loud. Unfortunately, even if he didn't speak his mind, there was someone else who definitely wouldn't hold anything back, much less when it came to annoying Shangyun Bingshu. "Little bitch, you better practice your jokes a bit because they're so bad it makes you feel like crying." Who else besides Lilith could enjoy seeing Shangyun Bingshu angry so much? Indeed. Shangyun Bingshu clenched her teeth and fists as she whispered through her pearly teeth, "This vixen." Surprisingly, she did not erupt as Bai Zemin and Lilith expected. Instead, Shangyun Bingshu took a deep breath and filled her lungs with air before slowly exhaling, while gradually releasing her clenched fists. "Oh ho?" The sound of Lilith's surprised voice, even though she was invisible, was clearly heard by both of them. "I won't lower myself. You can argue all you want and act like you've won something, even though I don't know what you're playing at. I don't care." Shangyun Bingshu spoke into the air, but her words definitely reached those for whom they were intended. She didn't wait for a reply and looked at Bai Zemin calmly. "Bai Zemin, what do we do now?" "Right." Bai Zemin frowned slightly and looked at the huge base in the distance, as he carefully thought about the next move. At this moment, night was reigning over the sky of Changping district. Earlier, Bai Zemin had asked Lilith if the explosive growth of the Earth would also affect its orbit, and thus its nature, such as the distance between the period of day and night. However, to his relief, Lilith told him that he did not need to worry about that matter. When the soul record reached the Earth, it actually reached the entire solar system as well. Therefore, all the planets in the solar system and certainly the entire galaxy were growing and evolving. In fact, the reason scientists were previously unable to explain the constant expansion of the universe was because it was caused by the soul record and mana, constantly expanding the size of everything in its path and extending farther and farther. With the Earth growing more than 3 times as large, the solar system, not the other planets, also grew the same size to accommodate the change, and thus the orbit of the world was not affected in the same way, as day and night continued working the same way. "Let's return to camp," Xietain said after suspecting several factors. He tried to keep his head cold at the moment, despite wanting to charge forward and force everyone to find their loved ones. After all, he was pretty sure that the leader of this base was Wu Yijin's father, and surely her mother would be there too. Xietain was in debt to Wu Yijin, and he promised to do his best to try to reach a peaceful settlement with her family. Therefore, he would keep his word as a man, instead of charging like an immature child to the front. Before Shangyun Bingshu could say anything else, Xietain suddenly vanished and disappeared from her sight, taking her by surprise. "I'll be right back. Wait here." She heard his voice before faintly feeling a whirlwind of wind rush past her before the place regained calm. Unfortunately, this base has several heat sensors installed on the walls and troops with advanced technology hidden everywhere. Lilith appeared beside Shangyun Bingshu and said in a lazy voice, "Invisibility is only a first-order skill that allows the user to become invisible by modifying the surrounding light or taking advantage of shadows, but it cannot hide the heat released by the human body." Shangyun Bingshu's expression changed slightly before she regained her calm. She looked at Lilith coldly and asked in an indifferent voice, "Why didn't you warn him if you know?" Lilith looked at her with a bitter smile and shrugged. "I'm afraid that's not how it works, Princess. I have my own limits too, and I'm honestly not sure that giving out that kind of information doesn't break the rules. Better safe than sorry. Besides, do you really think a few small heat sensors could present danger to someone like him?" Shangyun Bingshu stared at her for several seconds before turning her attention to the base in the distance. Although she could warn Xietain using the military radio, Lilith was right. It would be truly ridiculous to think that heat sensors would represent problems for someone with the talent and ability that man had. In a state of invisibility, Xietain hovered and in an instant closed the distance between him and the great wall of the base. Just as he was preparing to jump to the top of the wall, a shadow jumped out of one of the trenches and in an instant pounced on him. Although the soul evolver was fast, in Xietan's eyes it was a turtle movement. Still, he was a bit surprised when he saw the strange goggles over the woman's eyes, and 2 words flashed in his mind. Infrared goggles. Xietain didn't bother too much, and his enemy couldn't even do anything about it when she was knocked unconscious after receiving a heavy blow to the back of her head. Bang, 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 bang. Hundreds of bullets fell around Xietan's position, among which there was no shortage of skill-enhanced bullets. However, he didn't even bother too much, and simply moved away easily, ignoring the bullets that hit his armor without even causing his skin to itch. "These guys sure don't mess around." Xietain chuckled and threw the woman's body over his shoulder as he disappeared from everyone's sight. By the time the soul evolvers who were on the wall standing guard came down, Xietain had already disappeared without a trace, and leave them perplexed as to what to do next, other than to report to the higher-ups what had just happened. His goal was to sneak through the wall and capture a soldier to ask just 1 or 2 questions before letting them go free, but things didn't always work out the way you wanted them to. Even then, Xietain was satisfied that his objective had been accomplished in one way or another. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 596. Even MILFs aren't out of Daddy's reach. Chapter 596. Even MILFs aren't out of Daddy's reach. Xietain and Shangyun Bingshu ran off at full speed in a northerly direction. Although there were some soul evolvers who tried to chase after them, by the time they thought they had caught up, in reality the two had disappeared too long ago to be caught up. Unlike before when the two were scouring the lands of China without a fixed course in mind, this time Xietain and Shangyun Bingshu were aiming straight for the city under construction, where the Transcendent faction was located. Therefore, it was a lot simpler and quicker to get there. Even so, the two of them took more than 3 hours in total. After all, nighttime was especially dangerous since that was when the mutant beasts were out hunting, and thus the two encountered several obstacles that, although only minor, still caused the duo's movement speed to drop slightly. Immediately after arriving, the first thing Xietain did was to look for Evangeline. Evangeline was the commander in charge of leading the troops and protecting the southern area. The south meant unknown territory as opposed to the north, where they came from. Therefore, apart from Shangyun Bingshu and Xietain himself, he believed Evangeline was the most qualified for such a task. "Is something wrong?" she asked once Xietain stepped into her tent. Contrary to most, Evangeline and her troops slept separately from the main camp, since at least until the walls were finished, they would have to stand guard at all times. She was currently getting ready for bed, so she wore a simple turquoise silk robe, and her slightly tousled hair added a different charm compared to that chilling beauty that Xietain and the rest were used to seeing. Evangeline, I need you to help me with something. Xietan's eyes only looked at her long white legs for a second, before staring into her eyes deeply. I guess it has something to do with that thing you're carrying there? Evangeline motioned with her head as she looked at the fainted person Xietain was dragging. That's right. Xietain nodded and turned around to lay the female soul evolver's body on the ground. Then, he looked at Evangeline again and explained, I need you to ask her a few questions. I want to know who is the leader of the base this woman belongs to, the number of survivors, and if possible, the division of power. If that's not possible, then threaten her a bit, but don't go overboard. Evangeline raised an eyebrow and folded her arms, inadvertently causing her breasts to rise. She didn't realize that her little movement had actually exposed that she wasn't wearing a bra. Fortunately, Xietain was not interested in her despite her beauty. Therefore, he didn't even flinch and simply listened to her. That's weird, she said curiously. The Xietain I know would definitely get the information he wants to know out of this woman, even if he has to throw her to the strays. Xietain blushed slightly and felt a little embarrassed as he recalled events of the past. Back then, he had coldly threatened Evangeline by telling her that if she didn't cooperate after trying to murder him, he would throw her to the vagabonds of the North Camp, with both legs and arms broken, so that they would play with her to death. Circumstances are different. He cleared his throat and justified, this woman is a soul evolver belonging to a base far away from here. Besides, the problem is that I'm pretty sure the leader of that base is the father of Wu Yijin. The eyes of Evangeline finally flashed with understanding as she realized that the point was the father of Wu Yijin. No, the real important matter was Wu Yijin herself. I see. She nodded indifferently and while looking at the fainted woman said calmly, leave it to me. I'll give you the information you want first thing tomorrow morning, is that okay with you? Perfect. Xietain nodded and did not linger long at Evangeline's place. After saying goodbye, he headed straight to his tent. It was past 00 at night. Even so, when Xietain set foot inside his tent he saw that Qinming was still awake. Qinming? Why aren't you resting? Xietain asked in confusion as he took off the top of his armor. Qinming was currently sitting on a wooden chair reading a book with a relaxed expression on her kind face. Hearing Xietan's voice, she closed the book and stood up with a smile. Lord, I thought you might be hungry, so I was waiting for you. Would you like me to warm up your dinner? Qinming had studied Xietan's face for a second, and seeing him relaxed, she sighed a sigh of relief in her heart. Looks like things went well for the Lord, or else he might not be so calm. She was worried as Xietain had disappeared for almost the whole day to look for his family. Therefore, she had been silently praying that he would not meet disappointments and bad news that would make him suffer. At the end of the day, Xietain was her benefactor in every sense of the word, and thus, she wanted nothing but the best for him. I'd like to take a bath first. Xietain chuckled and pointed to himself. I've been running nonstop all day, so I'm a little sweaty right now. The eyes of Qinming flashed with a weird light as they roamed over the now naked torso of the young man in front of her. Lord, may I say something perhaps a little out of place? Xietain gave her a puzzled look as he stowed the chest plate of his armor in his storage ring before nodding. Go ahead. I'd like to ask you to be a little more careful when you decide to undress. Qinming smiled shyly, and her face flushed slightly as she said in a low voice, you are clearly unaware of your current charm. Even a woman who has already seen the world like me can't help but be attracted, not to mention a younger, inexperienced woman. Xietain was a bit tongue-tied. The corner of his mouth twitched a couple of times as he nodded stiffly. I'll keep that in mind. Qinming chuckled and bowed before excusing herself. She went to prepare a tub of hot water to allow Xietain to take a bath. Xietain shook his head and didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he muttered to himself, damn, even a hot mature woman isn't out of this daddy's reach. Swoosh. Lilith appeared without warning like a ghost, causing Xietain to subconsciously take a step back. She looked him up and down before folding her arms and saying with a hint of jealousy, if you're looking for a mature woman, then don't you have me? I'll be your MILF if you so want me. Xietain stared at Lilith and couldn't help but say dumbfounded, you? But you look like someone my age. Didn't I tell you before? Did you forget? Lilith suddenly stopped as she was about to say something. She cleared her throat and said calmly, no, it's nothing. Huh? Xietain made a strange face as he looked at her as if she was an idiot. I said it's nothing. Lilith snorted before disappearing. Lilith was going to say again that she was almost 1 century old, but soon regretted it. At the end of the day, even if Lilith was no different from a child in the eyes of most living beings in the universe, in the eyes of people like Xietain, she was indeed an old woman in terms of age, more so when he still hadn't shaken off the repressed thought of mankind from the past. About 20 minutes later, Qin Ming informed Xietain that the hot water was ready, so he practically flew into the temporary bath. As he immersed his body in the hot water, Xietain let out a deep growl like that of a satisfied cat, as he felt the exhaustion slowly leave his body. He lay there, silent with nothing but the gentle sound of the water oscillating with his every little movement. There were many things he had to think about and many more to plan, so everything had to be perfect. At this moment, Xietain was powerful, but his faction was still growing in many ways. A single mistake could mean the total collapse and death of countless followers who respected him, admired him, revered him, and trusted him practically blindfolded. Slowly, Xietain was adjusting to the position of an important leader and apt ruler. He understood that the least he could do to reciprocate to those who followed him was to live up to expectations. Let's hope everything goes well. Xietain closed his eyes and placed a damp towel on his eyelids before relaxing completely and sighing. Otherwise, it will be a bit of a problem. Xietain stayed in the bath until the water finally began to lose its warmth. By the time he reached the living room inside his tent, Qin Ming was standing in a corner while a bowl of soup with meat and noodles steamed on the wooden table. Xietain rubbed his hands together and thanked her for the care, before he sat down at the table and began to taste his dinner. He was really hungry even if he didn't say it out loud. Right, my lord, I almost forgot to report something to you. Qin Ming was smiling slightly at the sight of Xietain, eating like an excited child, before suddenly something flashed in her memory. Getting his attention, she explained, about an hour at most before you returned, Miss Wu Yijin and Miss Kai Jinji were here to update you about the progress of the first day. Xietain frowned slightly upon hearing this. The matter of building the city would probably be delayed a bit longer than expected if he wanted to carry out his plan as soon as possible, not that I have much choice either. Qin Ming naturally had no idea what he was thinking. After a moment's silence, she said somewhat hesitantly, My lord, Miss Wu Yijin seemed really disappointed before she left. She seemed really eager to see you. Xietan's movements froze for a second, and the spoon filled with soup stopped inches from his mouth. A few seconds later, he nodded and said quietly, Thank you for informing me. You're welcome. Qin Ming bowed before staying in silence. About 10 minutes later, Xietain wiped his mouth and drank the glass of natural juice Qin Ming had personally prepared before standing up. Qin Ming, I'll go see if Wu Yijin is still awake. I need to talk some important matters with her, he said before walking towards the exit. A smile formed on Qin Ming's lips as she looked at his back, and her imagination couldn't help but go wild as she mischievously thought, Looks like the Lord might have some fun tonight. Miss Wu Yijin is really lucky if that happens, though on second thought, she really deserves it. Qin Ming. Why yes. She jumped at the sound of Xietan's voice, and when she met his serious gaze, she thought her thoughts had been discovered. To her surprise, Xietain smiled slightly and said in a softer voice, Go and rest. Then, he walked out, not before adding, That's an order. Qin Ming released the breath she was holding, and patted her chest several times before laughing under her breath to avoid waking the rest. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 597 Temporarily Impossible to Achieve. Chapter 597 Temporarily Impossible to Achieve. Of course, Xietain had no idea what naughty thoughts his kind housekeeper had in mind. But regardless of what Qin Ming might be thinking, he had quite important reasons for seeking out Wu Yijin in the middle of the night, rather than lustful thoughts or anything similar. He walked through the streets of the place that in the future would be one of the cities prepared for mankind to survive in the apocalypse, and noticed very clearly that everything was much cleaner and tidier compared to when he left this morning. Xietain was really pleased with the job his subordinates were doing. There were several patrols constantly moving through the territory. After all, although many tents had been erected in separate areas according to the level of nobility and social status in the faction, trouble was inevitable when there were large crowds of trouble. Fortunately, since Xietain and Wu Yijin lived in the central area, it took him no more than 3 to 4 minutes to reach her tent. Leader? Leader? The two soldiers with light machine guns immediately made a military greeting when they saw the shadow of Xietain walking towards them. Not all the soldiers knew Xietan's face, but these two knew him very well since they were the two in charge of protecting Wu Yijin's living area. While she was powerful enough to protect herself, and probably only a lunatic would try to sneak into the central area of the faction where the strongest rested, Wu Yijin, as well as the rest, had no time to waste with minor matters. Bai Zemin returned the two men's greeting and easily passed beyond the restricted area. Walking about 50 meters further, he finally arrived in front of Wu Yijin's tent and knocked on the door softly before stepping back and waiting patiently. The two men looked at each other, and both smiled lasciviously when they saw Bai Zemin knocking on the wooden door Wu Yijin had placed in her tent. Why in the world would a young man visit a beautiful single woman in the middle of the night? The two soldiers naturally drew their own conclusions on the matter. Bai Zemin also had no way of knowing the thoughts of the two soldiers, or else he might spit out 2 liters of blood and die, thinking they were all fucking perverts. A few seconds later, a slightly grumpy voice sounded from inside the tent. "Who is it?" Bai Zemin blinked a little in surprise. After all, this was the first time he had heard Wu Yijin so grumpy. However, after he thought about it for a moment, he finally understood. In a few minutes, the clock would strike 1 a.m., and probably no one would be happy if their door was knocked on at that time. He coughed a little awkwardly and said aloud, "Wu Yijin, it's me, Bai Zemin. If you are resting, then forget it. We can chat early later on." Inside the tent, Wu Yijin was wearing white bunny pajamas. The pajamas even had 2 long ears that looked soft and fluffy, urging people to touch them. She was in a bit of a bad mood for not being able to see her loved one all day, and was currently eating a sweet chocolate bar to try to sweeten her bitter heart. Hearing someone knocking on her door, she wasn't even going to answer. However, after a few seconds of second thoughts, Wu Yijin realized that for the 2 guards to let someone walk through, then that person not only had to be trustworthy, but should also be of a fairly high rank. "Who is it?" she responded, unable to help but sound grumpy. "Wu Yijin, it's me, Bai Zemin. If you're resting, then forget it. We can chat early later on." Wu Yijin blinked stupefied as she heard the voice of the person on the other side of the door. Even in her dreams she would not mistake that voice so naturally. That person did not need to identify himself. Suddenly, she felt him start to move with the intention of moving away, and realizing that she had been silent too long, Wu Yijin automatically jumped out of her bed and exclaimed loudly, "Bai Zemin. Wait a minute." Bai Zemin had not even taken 5 steps when the door behind him opened a millisecond after he stopped upon hearing the voice of Wu Yijin. He looked over his shoulder, and his expression became a bit weird. "Don't worry, I wasn't sleeping at all." Wu Yijin was panting as if she had run a marathon, even though it had only been a few meters. That's how anxious she had become a moment ago. Bai Zemin cleared his throat and finally turned to look at her. Then, he pointed and asked cautiously, "May I come in? I need to have a talk with you." Oh, of course. Wu Yijin took a step back and stepped aside as she invited him in with a wave of her hand. Bai Zemin walked past her and couldn't stop the corner of his lips from moving up slightly as he whispered softly, "By the way, that's a very cute set of pajamas." Wu Yijin froze, and after a few seconds, she stiffly lowered her head to look at what she was wearing. She even stretched out both hands to the top of her head, feeling the 2 long fluffy ears. Her face turned as red as an apple, and Wu Yijin had never in her life wished to disappear from the face of the earth as strongly as she did now. She was wearing such childish clothes in front of the man she was trying to charm. For heaven's sake, Wu Yijin scolded herself. She had decided to start being more of a woman in all aspects after seeing Lily at the pool, but here she was, dressing like a little child. "It seems I can't change my course so easily after all." She sighed in her heart before closing the door behind her. Of course, Wu Yijin didn't know that her innocence and purity were precisely the 2 main factors why Bai Zemin liked her so much. At the end of the day, seductive and charming women could be found everywhere in this world, but a pure-hearted woman like her was definitely a very pleasant rarity to find. Bai Zemin looked around the interior and realized that despite being just a temporal tent, it was actually very nicely decorated. There was a lot of greenery, plants of all kinds, beautiful flowers, seeds of different colors, etc. The smell of nature was really nice to feel. "By the way, what's this?" he said, pointing to a strange tree about 80 centimeters tall. "Oh, that one?" Wu Yijin seemed to get a bit enthusiasm when it came to plants. She walked over to the blue tree and touched the strange blue fingernail-sized seeds, as she said in a low voice, "This mutant plant was found by our botany team, and is quite popular nowadays among the upper echelons of our transcendent faction. Thanks to its ability to dimly illuminate the environment without hurting the eyesight, many wish to have one, but it is quite expensive due to its rarity. Its name is lazuri tree due to the color of its light." Bai Zemin nodded silently. Practically the entire living room of the tent was illuminated by this mutant tree. This opened the eyes of Xietain even more to the fact that there were countless things that he did not yet know, and would probably know as time went by. The reason he had no knowledge of this mutant tree was because it was not important enough for anyone to bother to tell him. After all, the number of mutant plants studied on a daily basis was too large, and if Xietain had to be informed of each and every one of them, then he wouldn't have time for anything other than reading reports. By the way, Wu Yijin. He finally looked at her and decided to go to the core of the reason why he came all the way here late at night. Have you heard from the lab any news regarding the vaccine? I know we've been moving continuously, so there probably hasn't been time for much, but the curiosity was killing me. Vaccine? Wu Yijin blinked before something clicked in her memory. Not to Xietan's surprise, she shook her head and said a little bitterly, I'm afraid not. But from what I was informed today, we may not have the necessary equipment to create a vaccine. This was a development that Xietain had not expected. His faction had quite a bit of research and development equipment that had been found in different parts of Yanqing district, so he honestly believed that with all that they should be able to make something good. Now it seemed that things were not so simple. Wu Yijin seemed to know his thoughts as she quickly explained, although our lab has good equipment, it is not state-of-the-art. Liao Su's blood is too strange, and every time our team of scientists and chemists try to bond it with zombie blood or anything else, it simply separates on its own, as if it has a mind of its own. Xietain frowned, and his mind was a bit foggy on this matter. Although he had been a student of biology in the past, chemistry was never particularly his strong suit. Besides, it was true that biology today was not the same as it was 2.5 months ago. Not to mention the fact that Liao Su's blood was far from normal, as Wu Yijin had just pointed out. The stem cells in Liao Su's blood are too protective and develop at such an abnormal rate that they don't allow time to react with another component before moving away. Wu Yijin continued, still, it is good that he did not take his own life. According to the leader in charge of the lab, the regenerative and mutative capacity of the stem cells in Liao Su's blood disappears after a few hours, so, if he hadn't made this sacrifice for the sake of everyone, mankind would probably have missed a great opportunity. Earlier, Xietain had caught another zombie and reconverted it into a human. Unfortunately, that reconvert did not possess immune blood, and instead possessed an active skill called Steel Claw. This reconvert was currently being trained and quietly observed after joining the forces of the 2nd Brigade of the Blood Lance Legion, as his strength was highly prized. However, this fact caused Liao Su's value to skyrocket from Xietan's point of view. Forget it then, he said after some consideration, we will soon get another lab equipment, and if we are lucky it will be of better quality than what we currently have. Maybe that will help with the vaccine elaboration. Oh, you found new chemistry equipment on your outing today? Wu Yijin asked carefully as she studied Xietan's reaction, worried that he may have encountered bad news in the search for his loved ones. However, Xietan's expression was neither sad nor happy when he looked at her. He was silent for a few seconds before saying in a deep voice, Wu Yijin. Although I am not 100% sure, I am at least 90% sure that I found the base that your father leads. Wu Yijin's expression froze before her eyes trembled uncontrollably. She reached forward and clutched at Xietan's shirt as she asked in a trembling voice, my father is really alive? Wu Yijin was no different from Xietain in the family aspect. She was very close to her father, mother, grandfather, and some uncles and aunts. Therefore, Wu Yijin had been praying every night for the safety of all of them. So, now that there seemed to be important news regarding her father and mother, Wu Yijin's heart naturally trembled. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 598, China Renaissance and Wu Yijin's father status. Chapter 598, China Renaissance and Wu Yijin's father status. An hour later, Xietain left Wu Yijin's tent. After chatting with her for about 60 minutes, Xietain finally felt more relaxed. The two of them had managed to come to a pretty good agreement, not perfect as they probably both wanted it to be, but good enough to be considered a blessing in the situation they were in. Xietain felt quite complicated in his heart, because while he hoped that the parents of Wu Yijin were safe and unharmed for obvious reasons as he did not want her to suffer, he also hoped that this huge base had nothing to do with them. That way, Xietain could simply crush all opposition with brute force, and take over enemy territory a lot easier than having to be planning so many things, and considering so many details. Unfortunately, if the parents of Wu Yijin were alive, then that base was most likely led by Wu Qiqian, since Bai Zemin doubted that a person who was described as intelligent and ambitious by Shangyun Bingshu herself would allow such a terrifying power to rise up in his territory. Therefore, even though it was a bit problematic, Bai Zemin would prefer that the parents of Wu Yijin be alive and become a headache for him, rather than see the tears of that innocent girl spilling out uncontrollably. But what do we have here? Lilith glowed and appeared in front of Bai Zemin, still invisible to everyone else. She walked backwards with her hands behind her back as she looked at him with a gentle smile and said, "It seems that your skill stone heart really weakened greatly. Have you noticed the changes in your behavior too?" Bai Zemin nodded silently. It was impossible for him not to notice the changes in his attitude. Previously, Bai Zemin would definitely find not-so-kind methods to obtain power from the enemy base, even if it meant saddening Wu Yijin. After all, for the past all that mattered was the final target, and not the means one used to reach it. However, the present Bai Zemin was no longer a war machine. The current him, at the very least, could sympathize with the people close to him, even though they were not his family members. Hata Lilith laughed gleefully and disappeared without a trace. "Lilith, why do you seem happier when my personality becomes softer compared to when I become more powerful?" Bai Zemin asked the air as he walked towards his tent. However, he did not receive an answer. In the end, he couldn't help but shook his head and smile bitterly. There was no point in continuing to ask. He knew that if Lilith didn't want to answer something, then she probably wouldn't change her mind, even if the stars exploded all at the same time. The next day, in the South Zone, the survivors in charge of digging the great well that would extend for more than 100 kilometers to the sides were already working. The clock showed 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was about 3 hours before lunch, so everyone was quite energetic after having had breakfast 3 hours ago. Beyond the army compound, a group of people had gathered. "Evangeline, I leave everything to you." Bai Zemin looked at the foreign woman in front of him and smiled slightly. "Sure." Evangeline, as usual, wasted no words and simply nodded indifferently. Bai Zemin chuckled and shook his head. He had made Evangeline his third loyal follower. She was the first one aside from Kai Jinji and Kang Lan. Evangeline had heard from Bai Zemin the pros and cons of becoming his loyal follower earlier today, when she had gone to inform him of the information she had obtained from the female soul evolver he had captured the day before. Not to Bai Zemin's surprise, Evangeline didn't even think for more than a second before agreeing, thus effectively turning into the third loyal follower to receive the effective Bai Zemin subclass. Then, "See you later." Bai Zemin waved his hand towards the people behind Evangeline, before dashing off into the distance without waiting for a response. Shangyun Bingshu, Chen He, Wu Yijin, Kai Jinji, Zhongde, Nangong Lingxin, the 6 of them nodded towards the others, before chasing after Bai Zemin, upon activating lightning movement. The more agile ones naturally had to restrain themselves to avoid leaving the slower ones behind. Even so, the group was definitely running at over 300 kilometers per hour. Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder and sighed. For this operation, he did not know what he might face. Therefore, Bai Zemin took almost all of the most powerful soul evolvers from his faction, since if things went wrong, he might need support to protect his loved ones. Even then, the power of the current Transcendent faction could not be underestimated even without them present, especially now that Evangeline had become one of Bai Zemin's loyal followers. With everything docked properly, even 1 or 2 second-order creatures probably wouldn't be able to raise too many problems. "Leader, do we really have to use this junk equipment?" Zhongde couldn't help but complain as he palmed his rank 0 armor. Bai Zemin sighed and said in a tired voice, "Zhongde, what did I tell you before we left?" He felt like a father scolding his young son for misbehaving. "Oh right." Zhongde nodded and then rephrased his earlier words. "Bai Zemin, we really have to wear this junk equipment?" "Well, we can't just show up with shiny and powerful equipment," Bai Zemin pointed out loudly as the group raised a thick cloud of dust behind them. "Why?" Zhongde still didn't understand. Nangong Lingxin couldn't help but look at Zhongde and remarked, "I'm getting more and more glad that I'm not a strength-type warrior. It seems like all strength-based soul evolvers lose their intelligence. Even my dear big brother has become a donkey lately." Zhongde looked at Nangong Lingxin and said in a serious voice, "I say, Nangong Lingxin, I owe you something or what?" Wu Yijin shook her head and couldn't help but laugh. She was very happy after hearing Evangeline's report and learning that indeed, her father Wu Qiqian was the supreme leader of the faction called China Renaissance. At the same time, she was also a little apprehensive and worried about what the future held, and looking at Bai Zemin out of the corner of her eye, she prayed that her father would understand the times had changed, and that power also needed to change hands to adapt to those changes. Chen Yi looked at Zongda and explained Bai Zemin's plan calmly. Remember that for everything to go smoothly, Bai Zemin will play the role of a subordinate, or rather, a mercenary who, in order to get some benefits, joined our group and helped us to get here with much difficulty, becoming a valuable ally in the course of our trip. Shang Yun Bingshu noticed that Chen Yi paused, so she interfered and explained what Zongda clearly still didn't understand. If we show up at the camp with too flashy equipment, it might bring unnecessary trouble. Remember that our initial goal is to hand over the list with the name of the family members of each of our core team members before we start any other operations. The female soul evolver that Bai Zemin had captured before did not know the exact number of survivors that the China Renaissance faction had. Even so, she estimated that at the very least, there should be around 200,000. Of course, the figure alone was enough to leave everyone in shock. After all, they had all gone through so many hardships and climbed so many steep mountains, only to muster just over 30,000 survivors so far. Among so many people, it was only natural that there was a certain probability that one of them was a relative or friend of a member of the faction led by Bai Zemin. Since it was impossible in the short term to ask everyone one by one, he had no choice but to make a list of the names of the loved ones of those in the highest echelons of his faction. After all, Bai Zemin was not the only one who was searching for his family and longing to be reunited with them. The number of families broken at the beginning and during the course of the apocalypse was simply too great to call, and many were fighting for the sake of repairing those ties that were forcibly severed. Oh! The eyes of Zongda sparkled upon hearing Shang Yun Bingshu's explanation, and he exclaimed as if he had discovered a new world, much to the amusement of the group. By the way, Led Kai Jinji came to a halt when she saw Bai Zemin looking at her and stuck out her little tongue shyly before continuing. Bai Zemin, what do you plan to do after finding your family? With the strength of our group, it should be easy to crush the other party. Then, she realized that her words might be misunderstood, so she looked at Wu Yijin and clarified with a smile, I don't mean that kind of crushing. I mean with our strength we can subdue them anyway. Wu Yijin shook her head to indicate that she understood, and after a moment of silence, Bai Zemin explained what he had in mind. After finishing some arrangements, the first thing we will do is to study the situation inside the base and the surrounding area. Only after we have certain data will we move accordingly. Knowing yourself was undoubtedly important, but even more important was knowing your enemy. Know your enemy, plan, and you won't have to fear 100 battles. Roger. Kai Jinji chuckled and looked amused as she said aloud, doesn't this feel fun? Like an adventure where explorers visit other worlds or unknown lands. Chen Yi raised an eyebrow and looked at her in surprise. Kai Jinji, I didn't think you were the type of woman who daydreams. TSK. Kai Jinji looked at him and shook her left index finger from one side to the other as she said in a clear voice. Chen Yi, that's why Bai Zemin is more popular than you among the female soul evolvers of the three legions. Yu Chen He looked at her not knowing what to say. But Kai Jinji was not finished as she continued. Of course, there is also the fact that his position is higher than yours, his strength is also higher than yours, he is also more handsome than you, more firm in his decisions. Kai Jinji seemed to have done her homework the night before making comparisons between the two men, as she continued to name things one after the other like a locomotive that would never stop. Shang Yun Bingshu, Wu Yijin, and Chen Yi exchanged glances, and the three of them saw the corner of the other's mouth twitching uncontrollably. There's also the fact that that's okay, Jinji. Bai Zemin interrupted, feeling a little embarrassed. You've already made your personal preference clear. Who knew that Kai Jinji didn't seem satisfied as she looked at him and pouted prettily as she said in a grumpy voice, Bai Zemin, not just my personal preferences. Look, let's ask Nangong Lingxin about it then. Don't look at me. Nangong Lingxin shrugged her shoulders wisely. Cowardly woman, don't think I don't know what you're thinking? Well, in that case let's ask it too. Just as Kai Jinji looked at Shang Yun Bingshu and was about to say something, she noticed those blue eyes flashing coldly, and her small body trembled, so she hurriedly swallowed her words and closed her mouth. Bai Zemin really didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He still remembered the shy Kai Jinji who treated everyone carefully for fear of messing up, but now she had turned into a little mischievous girl who let no one get away with her mischief, even he was not safe. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 599. Wu Kikian, Part 1. Chapter 599. Wu Kikian, Part 1. The group composed of 7 soul evolvers with Xietain at the head, moved in a straight line most of the way, and only started to move in irregular patterns once they got close enough to the base where the China Renaissance faction was located. After all, according to the information Evangeline obtained from the female soul evolver, Wu Kikian had opened more than 5 armories and 3 military bases that had not yet been found by anyone else. It could not be excluded that perhaps the group known as China Renaissance had drones or any kind of smaller unmanned vehicles to investigate the ground from the skies. While the current Xietain group was powerful, they were lacking in the technological aspect, and mankind's technology could not be completely ignored if they did not want any bad surprises. Therefore, although they were still more than 200 kilometers away, the group slowed down in order to avoid attracting too much attention and stopped moving in a straight line, as if they knew the exact place they were aiming for. About 2 hours later, the 7 finally spotted the giant monster standing proudly in the distance. Moreover, now that the sun was shining brightly high in the sky, Xietain and Shangyuan Bingshu managed to see 2 large national flags flapping vigorously, one on each side of the north gate of the base. The reactions of Chen He and the rest were even worse when compared to the reactions Xietain and Shangyuan Bingshu had yesterday when they first saw the base. However, Xietan's next words served to clear their minds quicker than usual. Remember, from now on and until this operation is considered completed, I am only Xietain to others. Unless we are alone, no slips can be allowed. Is that clear? Roger. Yes. Okay. The 7 of them stopped charging at full speed and barely walked as they acted surprised at the sight of the large walls rising hundreds of meters into the sky. Well, it wasn't like they were really acting, as most of them were genuinely surprised, since this was the first time in their lives that they saw such a huge wall if they ignore the magnificent Chinese wall. Stop! Suddenly, more than 10 soul evolvers jumped down from the top of the wall and approached in an imposing manner. Several soul evolvers raised magic staffs or bone bows and arrows in warning from the top of the wall. In addition, 5 Type 71 heavy machine guns were aimed at the group of 7. There was also no shortage of armed soldiers raising their guns on high alert, as if they were about to face a great enemy. The tension was in the air, and it seemed that only a small button needed to be pressed for the entire base to go into all-out war mode. However, neither Xietain nor any of those standing next to him were surprised by this fact. After all 7 of them were soul evolvers, and anyone who wasn't an idiot knew perfectly well that a single soul evolver could easily wipe out an entire battalion if it was powerful enough. In fact, a soul evolver with a single destructive magic skill could wipe out half of this wall in a second. Therefore, it was no wonder that upon seeing the appearance of 7 people who did not dress like normal civilians, all reacted cautiously and alertly. Xietain stopped, and a moment later everyone stopped beside him. Ha ha, the performance of you 7 is really pitiful. Lilith's voice rang in Xietan's head, and it seemed like she was really laughing from the bottom of her heart as she said, I can tell from miles away that the expressions of panic and surprise are pure lies. The corner of Xietan's mouth twitched slightly for an instant before he regained his composure. He scanned the approaching group, and it didn't take him long to identify the leader. Brothers and sisters, my name is Ling Ming. May I know where you come from and what you seek? The leader was a small man, and his head was perhaps a little too large for his body size. However, the weirdest thing was that this man was carrying a giant sword which, besides being comical due to the size difference, also made him look more dangerous than normal. This character's name was Ling Ming, and he was currently a First Order Soul Evolver level 46. Ling Ming was in charge of the entire South Gate, and had been mobilized here to replace the previous leader after an event that happened last night, in which an unknown character whose face was never revealed appeared, captured one of them, and then disappeared without a trace. This fact was also another reason why everyone was so alert, and the main reason why Ling Ming kept a certain distance, while everyone kept their alert states at maximum. The 7 of them, as if they had trained him a million times, looked at Chen He. This kind of movement naturally did not go unnoticed by the soul evolvers belonging to the Chinese Renaissance. Ling Ming immediately focused on Chen He and labeled him as the leader of the group. Chen He cleared his throat and said loudly, Brother Ling, how are you? My name is Chen He. We are a group of survivors who came from Yanqing District and recently arrived in Changping District, which is why we had no idea that there was a base in this place. What? Impossible? Yanqing District? Bullshit? The reactions of the soul evolvers next to Ling Ming were truly wonderful. The expressions on their faces were comical, to say the least, but it was certainly understandable. Ling Ming was also stunned and his mouth hung slightly open as he looked at Chen He, as if he was crazy. However, he quickly regained his composure and shouted loudly, "Shut up! All of you, be quiet!" Bai Zemin watched the response of the group in front of him, and a glint of appreciation flashed in his analytical gaze. When Ling Ming shouted his order, they all followed it with barely a second or two of delay. This kind of reaction speed was really wonderful, and it was clear that all of them had either been military in the past, or had been undergoing strict military training during this lapse of time. Bai Zemin couldn't help but think how good it would be if these troops were his own. His strength would surely skyrocket considerably if the members of Bai Zemin's group knew that he was thinking of such things even without even setting foot inside the base. They probably wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. Ling Ming looked Chen He up and down and said in a deep voice, "Brother Chen He, please don't joke. Yanqing district is on the other side of the East Sea, and to cross the East Sea, you would need to at least have annihilated 2 or 3 million zombies." Ling Ming's words were naturally true, and the reaction of each of them was completely normal. After all, if someone told Chen He that a group of 7 people managed to cross an entire district, and in the process slaughter millions of enemies, he would definitely curse that person out loud. However, the reality was that Chen He was not lying. It was just that he knew that words would get no one anywhere, so he was currently considering whether he should show his strength or not. Just as Chen He hesitated, a person stepped forward. It was Shangyun Bingshu. Everyone's gazes automatically focused on her, and the place immediately went completely silent. While it was normal to see beautiful women as time passed and each of the female soul evolvers grew in terms of power, Shangyun Bingshu's beauty was simply transcendent. One did not need to be a genius or an excessively observant person to realize that she was not only beautiful thanks to evolution, but that in the past she should definitely belong to the femme fatale category. Taking advantage of that brief moment, she extended her right hand back and coolly said, "Freeze." Immediately after that, something happened that froze everyone's blood. Not only Ling Ming's group that had gone out to stop the group of 7, but also froze the blood of all those on top of the walls and those hiding in different areas. Crack, 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 crack. The constant crackling loudly rumbled the floor, and the temperature of the place plummeted in less than a second. Not even the mighty Ling Ming could comprehend what was happening before a breathtaking, beautiful but still terrifying scene appeared before his eyes. Everything approximately 1,000 meters in front and another 1,000 meters wide became a huge skating rink. The lush green grass that covered not a small part of the ground, the laboriously dug ditches that served as a means to stop the careless advance of the enemies, the obstacles that had been placed there, everything froze. Ling Ming looked at Shangyun Bingshu in shock, and when his eyes met that ice-cold gaze, he felt as if his soul was being pulled out of his body, not only because of how beautiful those blue eyes were, but also because of the glint of hidden danger that flashed occasionally in them. Ling Ming and anyone else could tell that the beautiful woman in front of them was even holding back, as her face was not sickly pale like when a soul evolver spent huge amounts of mana abruptly. If this woman could launch this kind of attack, then it would definitely be possible to take out a few million zombies in a month's time, and if she received help from the people beside her, it would definitely be a lot faster. But what shocked Ling Ming even more was that Shangyun Bingshu was not the leader of the group despite her strength. Therefore, when Ling Ming looked at Chen he couldn't help but wonder how terrifying the handsome young man in front of him was. "Brother Ling, we really aren't looking for problems." Chen He took the opportunity that Shangyun Bingshu's performance had created and said in a friendly voice, "We are just looking for a place to rest, and while we're at it, we would like to know if the family of one of our members is here." Ling Ming looked at Chen He, and a sparkle of hesitation shone in his eyes. If a group as powerful as this one joined them, the entire China Renaissance faction would become much stronger in an instant. However, it was also true that allowing such powerful existences in was dangerous. Basically, Ling Ming was hesitating whether he should pick up this double-edged sword or not. As he hesitated, his eyes traveled through each of the group of 7 and watched everyone carefully. However, when his eyes landed on Wu Yijin, his movement stopped for a moment before he shook his head, as if what he was thinking was not possible. However, Ling Ming's face suddenly changed as he remembered what Chen He had just told him, and to confirm hurriedly asked, "Wait a second. You guys said you come from Yanqing district?" "That's right." Chen He nodded with a serious expression on his face. Ling Ming looked at Wu Yijin and hesitantly asked, "May I ask this lady's name?" Ling Ming was actually a captain of the Chinese army in the past, and was in charge of practically 1/3 of the 17th Armored Battalion of Changping District. He had met Wu Qiqian once about 10 years ago, who at that time had not yet become the mayor of Changping district and was just the mayor of a small sub-district. That time, Wu Qiqian was visiting the military base where Ling Ming worked and only by coincidence managed to see him. But the main thing was that at that time, Wu Qiqian was not alone. He was with his wife and his little daughter, who at that time was maybe a little over 10 years old. Besides, he had seen a picture of Wu Yijin recently, so when he saw the young beauty in front of him he thought, could be. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner and the Apocalypse. Chapter 600, Wu Qiqian, Part 2 Halves. Chapter 600, Wu Qiqian, Part 2 Halves. Wu Yijin stepped forward and while looking at Ling Ming, announced her name in a clear voice. How are you? My name is Wu Yijin. Wu Yijin, Ling Ming muttered with wide eyes before his entire body trembled uncontrollably. He too took a step forward and asked excitedly, Miss Wu Yijin, may I ask your father's name? Wu Yijin smiled slightly in her heart and naturally understood what was going on. However, her expression on the surface simply showed confusion, as if she did not understand the reason why she was suddenly asked so many strange questions, since she could not let others know that she already knew that her father was the leader of this human establishment, or otherwise it might arouse suspicion. Wu Yijin smiled bitterly in her heart. She had not even met her family, but she was already hiding things, not to mention all the things she would have to hide from her parents for the time to come. Seeing the slight frown on Wu Yijin's face, Ling Ming hurriedly explained, sorry for the strange questions. It's just that not only is your appearance very similar to a person I know, but even your name is the same. If it's not too much trouble, could you tell me your father's name? Believe me, this is all for your own good. Wu Yijin acted as if she hesitated for a moment before slowly nodding. All right, I guess there's no need to hide it anyway either. My father's name is Wu Qiqian, the former mayor of Changping district. One of our group's reasons for heading here is because we are searching for our families. The expression of all the soul evolvers beside Ling Ming changed tremendously upon hearing Wu Yijin announce the name of her father. Ling Ming completely ignored everything she said after hearing the name Wu Qiqian, and automatically looked at a quite pretty woman beside him, before ordering in a deep voice, Fang Xietain, inform the base command center that Miss Wu Yijin, daughter of Leader Wu, has just arrived and is currently at the north gate of the base. The soul evolver named Fang Xietain nodded and pulled out a military radio from her leather bag. She pressed a button and took several steps away before she began speaking to the other party in a low voice. This Wu Yijin looked stunned, as if she really didn't understand what was going on. She and the rest even looked at each other as if they were completely blank regarding the present situation. Even though Lilith was laughing out loud and it was hard for Bai Zemin to maintain his shocked expression, he really had no choice but to adhere to the role he had to play. In fact, it wasn't just Bai Zemin who was currently having a hard time. Everyone was having trouble trying to contain the urge to laugh, as it was really unusual to see Bai Zemin and Shangyun Bingshu changing their expressions so much in such a short time. They would definitely love to be able to record the situation. Unfortunately, such a thing was not possible, or else the video would definitely sell very well among the Transcendent Faction's army. Ling Ming looked at Wu Yijin with a slightly more respectful expression, and said in a deep voice, Miss Wu, if you don't mind, could you please follow me to the reception building? Don't worry, it's just a few minutes away from the north gate. We can talk more quietly there, and I'll explain the situation on the way. This Wu Yijin looked at the 6 people next to her, before looking at Ling Ming and saying quietly, my friends. Of course, your friends are my friends. You can all come with us. Ling Ming smiled slightly at the rest of the group, and even though his smile was clearly forced, and without much interest, at least it was no longer as casual as before. Soon, the huge double doors swung wide open once they received Ling Ming's signal, and 2 double-cab military pickup trucks approached at full speed, gradually slowing down until they finally stopped next to the group. Please, Ling Ming gestured and invited Wu Yijin and the rest. After boarding the vehicles in 2 groups, the 2 military pickups turned around and passed beyond the gates with ease. Bai Zemin, Zhongde, Kai Jinji, and Nangong Lingxin were seated in a pickup truck, while Chen He, Wu Yijin, and Shangyun Bingshu in the other next to Ling Ming. Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder until the door closed with a loud bang. The corner of his lips curved upward slightly as he thought in his heart that this had been even quicker and easier than he thought it would be. They had practically walked into the enemy territory without causing any disturbance, and now it would be much easier to investigate and move around. But everything would be even easier and faster once Wu Yijin's identity was fully confirmed. Somehow it feels like we are being treated with less value than the others. Zhongde whispered quietly, so that the driver wouldn't hear anything. It can be helped. Kai Jinji quietly pointed out. Wu Yijin made her identity clear. Shangyuan Bingshu showed some of her terrifying strength, and that Lingming guy surely thinks that Chen Yi is the leader, must definitely be even stronger than her. On the other hand, we didn't even stand out a little bit. Nangong Linkson chuckled and said amused, to say that the four of us are no different from ignorable decorations is not exaggerated at all. As the three of them chatted quietly, they also did not forget that they were not here to play. Like Bai Zemin, they were all observing the situation outside the window to get a rough idea of what kind of place they were in. However, what greeted everyone once they left the vicinity of the gate where several thousand military personnel were stationed was a scene they had not expected to see. Houses and buildings of varying sizes stood neatly along the sides of the unpaved road. While these houses and buildings were not at all pleasing to the eye because most of them had been built with post-apocalyptic wood and bones of some mutant creature, there were hundreds of people working to paint them and make them look better. Bai Zemin and the others noticed that at least 80% of the buildings inside the base had been built quite some time ago, at the very least, a week or two before Earth expanded in the face of the imminent arrival of its second evolutive stage. Looks like this Wu Kikian character really has some ability. Bai Zemin whispered to himself. Here someone trusted to him must have foreseen many problems which they can now partially ignore, thanks to that foresight. The two military pickups traveled about 3 to 4 kilometers before stopping in front of an approximately 4-story building. There, 2 soldiers stood guard at the entrance, and on one side of the building was a huge parking lot with at least 400 to 500 vehicles of all categories. Stepping out of the vehicles, Ling Ming easily led the group of 7 people inside the building. Like the outside, the inside was not at all extravagant when compared to the modern buildings mankind had built in the past. However, it was not bad either. Ling Ming led them straight to the top floor, and after reaching a room he waved his hand. Everyone, please take a seat. I must return to my duty, but soon a person will come and communicate with you. I hope we can get along from now on. His last words were mainly addressed to 3 people for reasons Kai Jinji had guessed earlier, and after smiling at everyone and nodding his head, he excused himself. As everyone sat down, Bai Zemin observed that this room was clearly more luxurious than the other parts of the building. 3 comfortable leather couches, a lamp carpet covering the entire floor, even several lamplights with some kind of mutant object inside that dimly illuminated the interior even in broad daylight. A maid approached and poured several cups of tea before bowing and leaving the room, carefully closing the door behind her. Taking advantage of the silence, Bai Zemin looked to his left and asked, Wu Yijin, what happened? Indeed, it's my father. She said without hiding her excitement at all. The little girl was so happy that she was short of jumping up and down as she joyfully said, my father, my mother, even some of my uncles and cousins are alive. Shangyuan Bingshu and Chen Yi were smiling slightly as they looked at their childhood friend. Of course, they couldn't be happier now that one of them had finally managed to reunite with their loved ones again, after all the death and misery the world was going through. Bai Zemin also smiled slightly and nodded towards her as he expressed his good feelings. I am very happy for you, I genuinely mean it from the heart. Wu Yijin's eyebrows curved into a crescent shape, and 2 beautiful dimples appeared on her cheeks when she giggled happily as she felt that Bai Zemin's words were real, even though he would have to go through a lot of headaches. Wu Yijin felt that every second that passed, and the more she got to know him, the more she fell in love with Bai Zemin. He was like a magnet that would not let her escape even if she wanted to. He was so good to her that he was willing to waste valuable time and go out of his way just not to hurt her, and to Wu Yijin, actions were more valuable than a million pretty words. Bai Zemin's care and appreciation were clear to her, and this only helped to further strengthen her resolve to follow him to the end. Some of them continued to chat quietly, while others simply remained silent and waited patiently. Approximately 10 minutes later, the door to the room was opened with such vigor that it hit the wall with a loud bang. While Bai Zemin was glad that the building was made of wood containing mana or else the wall might have fallen down after receiving that powerful blow, a couple consisting of a man and a woman walked into the room. The more striking of the two was undoubtedly the woman. The woman, who looked less than 30 years old and looked really beautiful, immediately focused her eyes on a corner of the couch, and when she found that silhouette, her eyes filled with tears as she cried out the name responsible for her sorrows and joys. Yijin, Mom? Wu Yijin practically jumped out of her seat, and her eyes flooded with tears as she ran towards the woman who walked with trembling steps and open arms. Mom? She cried out again, but this time her voice was almost completely drowned out by tears and crying. Wu Yijin wrapped both arms around her mother and buried her head in her neck like a little child who had been bullied. "My child, my beautiful daughter, mama's baby." The woman, who looked really too young to be Wu Yijin's mother, whispered sweet words as she kissed her daughter's hair and fought back tears that were constantly threatening to fall. Wu Yijin's mother was truly worthy of being her mother, or rather, Wu Yijin was truly worthy of being this woman's daughter. Inky black hair that fell to the middle of her back, perfectly white skin with no imperfections whatsoever, a body that seemed to have been designed to commit sins, was hugged by a long white one-piece dress that set off the black of her hair even more. She even had a beautiful small mole on the lower corner of both eyes that, in contrast to Wu Yijin's big and wide eyes, looked more like the eyes of a charming fox. While Zhang and Chen Yi were slightly stunned, Bai Zemin ignored the beautiful woman completely. His attention was completely focused on the tall man who watched the mother-daughter reunion with a smile on his face. That somehow didn't sound right, right?